I'm going to tell you something that I've carried alone for a long time. Not because I was scared of being believed. I was scared of what happens after people believe it. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. There's something I need to say before I get into the story, and I want you to hear it clearly. I'm not insane. I'm not medicated or delusional or filling in gaps in my memory with fantasies. I'm a 76-year-old man with a solid grasp on reality, even if that reality is harder to believe than any fiction. I've spent more than half my life on a property in northern Minnesota, and I've experienced something that most people will never experience, and most people who do experience it will never speak about. I'm speaking about it now because I think the world needs to know, and because I'm running out of time, I've lost my left hand. I'll show you that later if you need proof, though I don't expect it will convince you of anything beyond the fact that I had an accident with a tool or an animal. But the hand is connected to the story, and the story is the truth. Not metaphorical truth. Literal truth. Something moved through the woods of northern Minnesota for 30 years, and I fed it, and I learned from it, and it learned from me, and then it marked me. This isn't a campfire story. This isn't something I'm embellishing for effect. I'm telling you what happened because one day I'll die, and when I die, some people will come to this property, and they'll find evidence of what happened here, and they'll try to explain it away. They'll say I was a hermit who went mad. They'll find the grave I dug. They'll find the offerings in the forest. They'll find the shelter where it lived in its final years. And they'll make narratives that fit their understanding of the world. And those narratives will be wrong. So I'm telling you first. I'm putting my testimony on record, so to speak, so that when the official narratives start forming, someone will have heard the truth from the source. My name is Martin Oakes. I'm 63 years old. I live on a property in Cook County, Minnesota, about 15 miles northeast of Grand Marais, set back in the woods far enough that my nearest neighbor is 7 miles away through timber. I've been on this land for 31 years. I bought it in 1993 with money from my father's estate, 43 acres of old-growth pine and birch running down to a creek that feeds into the Brule River system. The cabin was a wreck when I got it. Tar paper walls, a roof that leaked into every room, a well that ran iron-tinted water that stained everything orange. I spent my first 5 years rebuilding, winter by winter, summer by summer, working alone, because that was the whole point. I'd come up here to get away from people. I was working offshore then, on drilling platforms in the Gulf. 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off. And that schedule, that constant switching between the noise and pressure of rig life and the silence of this place, it split me in half. I needed the quiet to survive the noise, and I needed the noise to justify the quiet. The offshore work was good money. Good enough that by 1993, I had nearly $200,000 saved. My marriage had ended in 91, and there was a daughter involved, Sarah. I was supposed to see her on alternating weekends, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't do the transition from the rig back to the world, spend a few days pretending I knew how to be a father, then turn around and go back. It was cruel to her, and I knew it even then, so I stopped coming back. My ex-wife took me to court, and a judge told me I had to pay child support, and I did, every month without fail. But I never went back to see the girl. It's one of the truths about myself that I've had the most time to think about. Living out here, you have all the silence you could want, and it turns into a mirror. By 1998, the cabin was livable. Real roof that didn't leak, real floors that didn't rot, insulation that actually worked to keep the brutal Minnesota winter out. I'd built a workshop on the south side, a lean-to structure with thick walls where I could process game and store tools. I'd split wood for 5 winters ahead because I liked the work, liked the rhythm of it, and because planning was cheaper than being cold in February when the thermometer dropped to 30, 40, 50 below zero. I had a well that ran clean water now, and a root cellar where I could keep vegetables and meat through the winter. It was a functioning homestead, isolated and self-sufficient. The first time I saw the prints, I didn't know what I was seeing. It was early October, first hard frost of the season. The birch leaves were turning from green to yellow, and the light was that particular gold it gets up here in autumn, low and sharp, coming under the trees at an angle that makes every leaf glow. The kind of light that makes the forest look lit from inside, like it's generating its own illumination. I was walking the perimeter of my property, checking winter wood stores, making sure the racks I'd built were solid, because bears were active that time of year, their metabolisms running up to prepare for hibernation. They could get dangerous if they were hungry enough. That's when I found the prints in a soft patch of soil near the creek about 200 yards below the cabin. A depression in the earth that was clearly from something large and heavy, something that had left a mark deeper than any bear print I'd ever seen. I'd grown up in Minnesota, hunted since I was 10 years old, spent summers at my uncle's cabin up north, where black bears were a constant presence. I'd track them for sport, learning their patterns, understanding their movements. I knew their prints inside out. The way the hind foot left 5 toes in a broad pattern, the imprint of claws visible at the tips. The way the front paw spread differently, asymmetrical, one side heavier than the other. I could read a bear's mood in its tracks, could tell if it was hunting or foraging, fleeing or investigating. These tracks were something else entirely. The hind foot was 16 inches, maybe 17, 5 toes, evenly spaced, almost perfectly symmetrical. The heel was narrow, more defined than a bear's broader pad. The stride was wrong for a bear, too long, the distance between prints suggesting legs that extended fully with each step, rather than the shorter gait of quadrupedal animals, standing briefly on their hind legs. This was something that walked upright as its normal mode of locomotion, not as an occasional tactical shift. I'd never seen a bear walking like that except in those 2 or 3 seconds when one would rear up on hind legs before dropping back down on all fours. And even then, the gait was shambling, unbalanced, temporary. The pressure points were even, the placement deliberate. Whoever or whatever had made these prints was comfortable on 2 legs. These prints went for 30 yards, a direct line through the forest floor like something was walking with purpose. No wandering, no stopping to sniff or investigate. Just a deliberate path from the creek bottom up toward the ridge. Either way, it was clear that whatever made these tracks knew where it was going. I followed them until they disappeared into a rock outcrop where the bedrock rose up and you can't leave a print in stone. I stood there and looked back at the trail I'd followed, and I felt something I couldn't name. Something like recognition, but from something I didn't have a memory of. I told myself it was a misidentification, a deformed bear print, my brain filling in details that weren't there. I was alone too much, probably, seeing what I wanted to see. But I started paying attention after that. Over the next weeks and months, I found more tracks, different locations, always in soft ground near the creek or in the clearings where the snow held deep. A handprint, 4 fingers and a thumb, splayed on a flat rock near the water. I measured it with my hand, laid my palm next to it, spread my fingers as wide as they'd go. It was nearly twice the size of mine. The proportions were almost human but stretched. The fingers too long, the palm too wide. Nothing detailed, just dates and locations. What the weather had been like. A hunter's log, basically. Except what I was hunting wasn't something I wanted to kill. I wanted to know what was living in the forest behind my cabin. By December, I had 18 entries. The prints appeared in a pattern. Every 10 days or so, something large and bipedal was moving through my land, crossing the creek, investigating the area around the cabin. Then it would disappear into the deeper forest for a week, and the cycle would start again. What fascinated me most was the precision of the route. The tracks followed a deliberate path, almost as if the creature had established a circuit, a territorial boundary that it checked regularly. I began to understand that I wasn't just living near this thing. I was living inside its territory. My cabin, my clearing, my 43 acres, they were all part of a larger domain that belonged to something else. The realization should have frightened me, but instead it created a strange sense of comfort. I wasn't truly alone out here. An unseen, unknowable neighbor, but a neighbor nonetheless. I started marking the routes on a topographic map. Blue pen for definite sightings, pencil for probables. The map on my kitchen table began to fill with marks, and a picture emerged. The creature had a primary trail that came down from the northeast ridge, crossed the creek at a specific ford, circled the cabin at roughly 100 yards distance, then moved to another feeding area I'd identified about 3 miles south. This was not an animal wandering aimlessly. This was a being with schedule, with purpose, with knowledge of its territory that had taken years to acquire. 42 below zero in late January, wind chill driving it down to 70 below. The power went out for 9 days. I read by oil lamps and kept the wood stove fed and listened to the wind come down off Lake Superior like something alive, trying to claw through the walls. Around mid-February, I woke up to something outside the cabin. Not wind, not a branch falling. A sound like breathing, deep and slow, audible even through the log walls. I got out of bed and grabbed the rifle I kept loaded in the corner and looked out the window into the darkness. There was a moon that night, 3/4, bright enough that the snow glowed blue-white. But the sound was still there. A presence on the porch, maybe 3 feet from the glass. I could feel it the way you feel a storm before it arrives. That pressure in the air that says something large is close. I stood there for 10 minutes, rifle resting in my hands, not pointing it, not lowering it. By morning there were prints again, right outside the window where I'd been standing. I measured them with a piece of string and wrote down the dimensions. The toes splayed outward, as if whatever made them had been standing upright, looking in at me while I held a rifle and watched the dark. What was I going to say? The sheriff's office would send someone out. They'd find nothing, and I'd be the crazy guy in the woods seeing things. More importantly, I realized I didn't want them to find anything. The more I tracked those prints, the more I studied them, learned from them, the more I felt something shift in how I understood the forest around me. And I hadn't been for years, probably. I just hadn't noticed until now. Or maybe it hadn't noticed me until now. By April, the snow was gone and the ground was soft again. I found a nest about a 1/4 mile from the cabin, in a dense stand of black spruce. A depression in the moss and needles, roughly circular, maybe 4 feet across. Branches broken nearby, some pulled down and laced together to form a kind of lean-to shelter over the depression, hair caught on the low branches, dark, coarse, longer than any bear hair I'd ever seen, maybe 4 or 5 inches long, kept them in a film canister. It's in a drawer in my bedroom, and I look at it sometimes and just know that what happened after, what's still happening, was set in motion the moment I picked up that hair. Some things you do change the trajectory of your life, and you don't understand that until much later, when the changes are already irreversible. By that summer, I knew its schedule. It came down from the ridge behind the cabin roughly every 10 days. I'd find fresh prints, sometimes hair, sometimes scat that was clearly not animal. The scat was what fascinated me most. It carried the smell of meat, but with something else underneath, something musky and wild. I collected samples in jars, kept them in the basement, studied them the way a scientist might. I was trying to understand the diet, the metabolism, the biological requirements of whatever was out there. Salmon scraps from fish I'd caught in the creek, deer meat wrapped in butcher paper and left on a flat rock about 100 yards from the cabin. I told myself it was an experiment, like I was gathering data on whatever was out there. Really? I think I was lonely. I'd built this place specifically to be alone, and I'd succeeded so completely that isolation was starting to feel like suffocation. I'd cut off contact with everyone I'd known. No phone lines out here, no internet, no visitors. Just me and the trees and the sound of my own voice talking to the empty cabin. No mess, no sign of scavenging. I started hunting specifically for it, taking deer in the fall using my rifle, cleaning them on the back porch, and leaving portions out on a platform I built between 2 birch trees. The way other people might set out bird feeders in winter, I was feeding whatever was living in the forest behind my cabin. I built a feed log, kept track of what I left and when. Elk in December, after I'd drawn a late-season tag in the mountains south of here. Fish in the spring and summer. By 1999, I was spending a significant portion of my hunting year providing for it. Fish in the spring and summer. By 1999, I was spending a significant portion of my hunting year providing for.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
Of regular feeding was intense. The creature came closer, more often. I'd find its prints right at the edge of the clearing where I'd built the cabin. Once, I found prints that led all the way around the building, circling it at a consistent distance, like something was mapping the structure, learning its dimensions. I measured the stride on those prints, over 4 feet between steps. The spacing suggested a deliberate pace, not hunting, not fleeing. I started keeping meticulous records, a log where I noted every piece of food I left, every print I found, every sign of the creature's presence. I noted the weather, the time of day, the phase of the moon. I was trying to find the pattern, the underlying logic to its movements. There were cycles I could sense but not quite articulate. It came more often during new moons. It came more frequently when the weather was changing. It seemed to come when I was working outside, like it was timed to my activities. By January of 1999, I realized something that changed how I understood the whole situation. I wasn't tracking a random animal that happened to pass through my territory. The creature was learning me the same way I was learning it. It knew when I was outside. It knew where I went and what I did. And it was deciding, day by day, whether to trust me or not. The first major snowstorm of that winter came in mid-January, 20 inches in 24 hours, wet, heavy snow that brought down branches and covered everything in white. I spent the whole day clearing around the cabin, cutting branches that threatened the roof, stacking firewood to keep it accessible. By evening I was exhausted. I stayed inside, ate dinner, and went to bed early. I woke in the middle of the night to silence, that particular silence that snow creates, muffling everything, making the world feel isolated and small, and underneath the silence, breathing, heavy, measured breathing, somewhere on the porch. I got up carefully, pulled on my jacket, and looked out the window. Nothing visible. The porch was a blank expanse of white, but the breathing continued. I could hear it clearly. I took my rifle and opened the door. There, maybe 10 feet away, was a dark shape, almost invisible against the darker wall of trees beyond. The snow had not yet covered it. I could see its breath steaming in the cold. It was standing perfectly still, watching me. We stood there, human and unknown creature, separated by snow and darkness and centuries of evolution, and neither of us moved. I raised my empty hands, palms out, the gesture that humans make to show they're not a threat. The creature tilted its head. Then it turned and walked away, leaving deep tracks in the snow that would still be visible the next morning, proof that this had actually happened. I went back inside, and I didn't sleep. I sat by the window and I watched the snow fall, and I thought about what it meant that something like that existed. Not as a theoretical possibility, but as a presence that could breathe the same air I breathed, walk the same ground I walked, and choose not to harm me. By February, the visits had changed character entirely. The creature was no longer just appearing at the edges of my awareness. It was coming to the cabin deliberately, without the caution it had shown before. I'd step outside to split wood and find it standing at the tree line, watching. I'd come back from hunting and find that it had been on the porch while I was gone, eating the food I'd left, sometimes even examining the cabin itself. I found handprints, clear and unmistakable, on the window glass, large hands pressing from outside, as if testing the barrier between us. By 1996, I'd become a man of routines and rituals. I'd wake at dawn, drink coffee on the porch, watch for movement in the forest. I'd spend the mornings working, chopping wood, repairing structures, maintaining the property. I'd hunt in the afternoons or work on the cabin interior. Evenings, I'd prepare food and leave it at the designated spot. Nighttime, I'd sit by the window and wait for signs. The prints had started forming a pattern. I mapped them on a large sheet of paper I kept on the table, marking every location where I'd found evidence. Over months, a picture emerged. The creature had a territory that extended far beyond my property, probably covering several square miles of the surrounding forest. But there was a core area, a roughly circular zone centered on my cabin, where it spent a disproportionate amount of time. It was in this core area that it left the most evidence, the clearest tracks, the most intentional signs. I started to notice subtleties in the tracks themselves. There were slight variations in the gait, in the pressure marks, in the positioning of the toes. I realized I was seeing multiple individuals. There was the large one, the one making the deepest prints. But there were others. A smaller one, maybe juvenile. One with a slightly different stride, perhaps injured. They weren't solitary creatures. They were family. I began to think of the large one as male, the smaller one as female, the smallest set of prints as offspring. I gave them names, though never out loud. The father I called William, the mother, Eleanor, The child, simply young one. I don't know if these were accurate designations. I don't know if they were even separate individuals or manifestations of a single creature's different movements at different times. But naming them made them real to me in a way that abstract tracks never could. In 1997, I decided to build the platform, a simple structure, just 4 strong posts sunk into the earth, a flat wooden surface about 8 feet square, elevated maybe 3 feet off the ground. I built it in the clearing, about 150 yards from the cabin, and I left meat on it. Whole deer carcasses, eventually. I was spending a significant portion of my money on ammunition and tags so I could hunt more, kill more, provide more. It took them weeks to trust it. I found the deer I left, sometimes partially eaten, sometimes just moved. They were investigating it cautiously, testing whether it was a trap, whether it was safe. I built a shelter from branches over part of the platform to provide cover if they wanted to feed without being fully exposed. That changed things. Within days of adding the shelter, the deer were gone, consumed entirely, bones scattered. I started varying what I left. Not just deer. I'd trap rabbits and leave them. I'd catch fish in the creek and leave them. I learned what they preferred and I provided it. It became the structure of my days. Hunt, kill, butcher, prepare, leave. Then wait for the evidence that they'd found it, consumed it, accepted it. I stopped viewing myself as the hunter and them as the prey, the subject of study. The relationship had inverted. I was the provider. They were the judges of what I provided. I was training them to accept me as part of their ecosystem, or maybe they were training me. In the spring of 1998, I made contact with someone I probably shouldn't have. There was a man who came through Grand Marais sometimes, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Richard Graves. He'd written some papers on animal behavior, particularly on social structures in mammals. I managed to catch him at the library in Grand Marais, and I asked him some hypothetical questions. What would be the social structure of an unknown primate? How would family groups function? What would be the signs of communication? He was patient with me, though I could tell he thought I was either researching a novel or dealing with some mental illness. He suggested books. He talked about hierarchy, about dominance and submission, about the importance of physical proximity in social bonding. He said something I've never forgotten. He said, "The most important thing animals need is to know where they stand in the social order. Once they know that, everything else follows." I left that conversation understanding that what I was doing, what was developing between me and the creatures in the forest, was about establishing a social hierarchy. They were testing me to see if I was friend or threat. I was providing to show submission, to demonstrate my place as someone lower in the order, someone who served them rather than hunted them. The first time I saw it face to face was autumn of 1999, 6 years after I found the first tracks. I was splitting wood on the back porch, late afternoon, sundown past the ridge. The cabin was behind me, the forest in front. I was working through a cord of oak that I'd cut and dried the year before, the maul going up and down in rhythm, my breath clouding in the cold. The forest was quiet, in that way it gets in October, the migrating birds already gone, the insects deep in the ground for winter, everything still and waiting for the cold. And I felt it before I saw it, that same pressure in the air, the sense of something large and aware nearby. I turned around, and it was standing at the tree line, maybe 60 feet away. Between 2 tall pines, it was 7.5 feet tall, maybe 8. The exact height I still can't say with certainty, because you're never quite still long enough to measure. Covered in dark brown hair, thick and long, matted in places, especially around the shoulders and neck. The shoulders were impossibly wide, maybe 4 feet across, tapering down to a narrow waist. The arms hung long, almost to the knees, with hands that were clearly hands, not paws, 5 fingers, opposable thumbs. The head was the wrong shape for anything I had a category for, narrow and long with a prominent brow ridge that cast the eye sockets in shadow. And the eyes. I've spent 25 years trying to describe those eyes, and I still can't get it right. They were intelligent, not animal intelligence, not the way a bear or a wolf looks at you when it's trying to figure out if you're a threat or an opportunity. This was something else, something that saw me not as prey or threat, but as a subject of study. It tilted its head slightly, the way a dog tilts its head when it's trying to understand something, and I realized I was holding my breath. It stood there for maybe 30 seconds, and during that time, I couldn't move. Not frozen by fear, not exactly. Frozen by recognition, like some part of me that had been waiting my whole life had just met something it was supposed to meet. All those years of isolation, all those years of running from people and trying to disappear into the forest, they'd been leading to this moment. I was being recognized by something that had been recognizing me long before I knew it was there. I noticed details I wouldn't have thought to notice in that moment. The way its breath steamed in the cold, visible in small clouds. The texture of its fur, rough and matted, darker at the shoulders, where it seemed to have 2 different coat densities. A scar on its left forearm, old and healed, running from elbow to wrist. The way its massive hands hung at its sides with the fingers relaxed, not clenched. The way it balanced, weight equally distributed, feet planted firmly. There was nothing defensive in its posture, nothing aggressive. It was simply there, observing, evaluating, the same way I'd been evaluating it for 6 years. Then it turned and walked back into the trees. I watched it go, watched the way it moved, absolutely upright, arms swinging at its sides, gait deliberate and precise. It didn't lumber or shuffle. It didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. It moved like a person who knew exactly where it was going. Each step was measured, controlled, the kind of walk a human takes when they're thinking about something else, comfortable in their body, at home in the landscape. When it disappeared into the forest, I sat down, right there on the porch with the maul still in my hands, and I cried. Not from fear. I don't have a word for what it was. Relief, maybe. Loneliness finally being broken by the thing that was supposed to break it. Or maybe I was crying because in that moment, I understood that my life before this instant had just become past tense. I sat there for what must have been an hour, the maul growing heavy in my hands, my body going numb with cold. The sun dropped past the ridge. The light changed from gold to purple to the deep blue-gray that means night is coming. And I didn't move. I didn't go inside. I didn't prepare food or tend the fire or do any of the things that had structured my days for the past 6 years. I just sat there, tears drying on my face, and I stared at the spot where the creature had disappeared into the trees. And I understood that everything was different now. Everything was going to be different. After that, it came closer. The visits increased from every 10 days to every 3 or 4. I started to understand the timing, the patterns. It preferred dusk, that gray time between afternoon and dark when the light gets diffuse and uncertain. It stayed longer, sometimes visible for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, watching me work or watching the cabin. I never felt threatened. That's important to understand, and I know it will be hard for people to believe. People will ask me later, "Didn't you feel scared?" And the answer is no. What I felt was purpose. For the first time in my adult life, every action I took meant something to something else. Every meal I prepared, I was preparing for two. Every fire I built in the stove was warming a space for a visitor. Every morning I woke up and looked out the window to see if there were new prints in the snow. And every time there were, I felt something like joy. I began to understand William's patterns with increasing precision. He came on clear nights more than cloudy ones. He seemed to prefer the quarter-moon phase, neither too bright nor too dark. He came more often in the hours just after sunset, that liminal time when the day animals had retired and the nocturnal world was just waking. Sometimes I'd be chopping wood, and I'd sense his presence before I heard anything or saw anything, and I'd turn to find him standing at the tree line, watching. Other times I'd step outside for an evening smoke, and he'd be there, 50 feet away, motionless, his dark shape barely distinguishable from the shadows of the trees behind him. I learned to read his moods through his body language. When his shoulders were relaxed, the visit was peaceful, observational. When his shoulders were tense, drawn up toward his neck, he was in some kind of distress. I saw him that way several times in the winter of 2000, and I increased the portions I left out, trying to compensate for whatever was troubling him. When his head was up, ears alert, he was interested in something, a new scent, a sound from deeper in the forest, some stimulus from his larger world that I couldn't perceive. And when his head was down, his gaze focused on the ground or on me in a steady, contemplative way, he seemed peaceful, content. At those times, I felt like we were in conversation, even though no words were spoken. I started leaving notes. Not notes exactly, but physical offerings that were more deliberate. A shirt I'd worn, left on the rock where I usually placed the food. A blanket from the cabin porch, folded carefully. A photograph of myself, laminated to keep it dry, stuck in a cleft of the birch tree where the creature visited most often. I wasn't sure it would understand these things the way I meant them, but I had to try. I had to try to communicate something beyond just the basic transaction of hunger and provision. And the Bigfoot, it understood. I know that sounds impossible to anyone reading this. I know how it sounds, but I know it because it responded. It left things for me. A section of honeycomb, still sealed in wax, laid carefully on the porch railing. I realized later it must have had to climb to reach the railing, must have understood that I might find it there. The comb was fresh, still slightly warm when I touched it, and inside the honey was a deep amber color. I tasted it. It was unlike any honey I'd ever had, with a complexity of flavor that suggested the bees had been feeding on wildflowers I didn't recognize. I realized he was showing me where he found resources, what he ate when he wasn't consuming the deer and elk I provided. He was letting me into the knowledge of his world. Feathers appeared next. Arranged in a pattern on a flat stone that I still have on the shelf above my kitchen sink. I still have that stone. The feathers are long gone, but the arrangement is burned into my memory. A pattern that resembled a sun or a star, with the feathers radiating outward from a center point. Some feathers were large, from a hawk or eagle. Others were smaller, songbirds maybe. They were arranged with such deliberation, each one placed at a precise angle, that there was no possibility of accident. This was intentional art. This was communication. A bone appeared in the snow outside my window one January morning, positioned upright as if it had been hammered into the frozen ground. It was polished smooth, the surface worn and shaped by something like care. The bone was from an elk, I think, the femur of something large. How long had he carried it? How had he known to polish it, to shape it, to present it this way? I still have that bone. It sits in a wooden box on my dresser, and sometimes I pick it up and I feel the smoothness of it, and I think about the fact that something with hands, strong enough to break a tree, could also be gentle enough to transform a raw bone into an object of beauty. A message about what? I don't know. But it was communication. We were speaking a language that had no words. We were speaking through objects, through gifts, through the careful arrangement of things. William was teaching me his vocabulary, and I was beginning to understand it. The years compressed into each other. Winter became spring, became summer, and I was feeding a Bigfoot, and more than that, I was being fed by it. The relationship had shifted somewhere without me noticing. I was no longer the observer, I was the observed, and I realized I preferred it that way. The isolation that had felt like suffocation when I arrived here had transformed into solitude. There's a difference. Isolation is when nobody knows you exist. Solitude is when one being knows you completely, and that's enough. In 1999 and 2000, I was still trying to maintain the appearance of a normal life. I'd run down to Grand Marais once a month for supplies. I'd talk to people in the general store and the post office, nod at fishermen heading down to the river. I paid my property taxes. I paid my child support every month without fail. A check mailed to an address I never updated. I was paying money to a daughter I'd never met. I don't know if that makes me look like I had a conscience or just like I was trying to ease some guilt that couldn't be eased. Probably both. By 2005, I'd stopped making the trips to town. I'd arranged for a supply truck to deliver the basics once a quarter: rice, beans, flour, salt, tools, ammunition. A man named Carlos ran the delivery service, didn't ask questions, just left the boxes on the porch. By then I'd become the kind of person people don't look at twice. The old hermit in the woods, eccentric but harmless. Nobody came out to the property. Nobody cared what I was doing out here. In the summer of 2003, 10 years after I found the first tracks, I had a visitor. A man named Thomas Brenner claimed to be a wildlife researcher from the University of Minnesota. He'd heard rumors, he said, of something unusual in the Cook County area. People talk, fishermen along the Brule, hikers, the small-town community. There were stories, dogs going missing, a family that reported seeing something large moving through their backyard at night. Would I be willing to share what I'd observed? I told him to leave, not politely. I was angry in a way that surprised me. The idea that I would allow this thing I'd built with the Bigfoot to be invaded, studied, documented by someone else, it felt like a betrayal. Not of the creature, of myself, of the understanding we'd developed. He stood there on my porch, looking at me like he was trying to take my measure. And then he said something that stuck with me. He said, "You understand, it's going to want to reveal itself eventually, right? You can't keep a secret like this. The world finds out. They always find out." I didn't believe him then. I believed I could contain this, that the Bigfoot and I could exist in this private world I'd built out here in the woods, and nobody would ever know. That I'd found something true and important, and I could protect it by keeping it hidden. He left, and I locked the gate behind him, and I didn't think about him again until much later. By 2008, 15 years into the relationship, the Bigfoot was coming to the cabin regularly, multiple times a week. I'd started to recognize patterns in the visits. It came around dawn and around dusk, the two times when the light was uncertain. It came more often when the weather was bad, as if it was seeking shelter nearby. And it started to come when I was awake, not just leaving evidence of its presence. I built a shelter for it, a structure of branches and logs about a quarter-mile into the forest, insulated with moss and leaves and covered with pine boughs for weatherproofing. I left meat there, clothing, blankets, things I thought might provide comfort. And it used these things. The shelter showed signs of habitation, worn spots where it lay down, scattered bone fragments, hair caught on the wooden frame. In winter, there would be tracks around the shelter, paths worn deep in the snow where it would pace. I was 60 years old, and I'd organized my entire life around feeding a Bigfoot. My work on the offshore rigs had ended years ago. I'd saved enough. I lived simply. I hunted and fished, grew a garden in the small clearing I'd carved out near the cabin. I made money selling firewood and rough-cut lumber to locals who'd ask fewer questions about where I got it if they knew me. Everything was secondary to this, to maintaining the territory, keeping the area quiet, making sure nothing interfered with the arrangement I had with the creature. People thought I was odd, but that had always been the case. The locals in Grand Marais left me alone. The few times someone drove up the access road toward my property, I'd meet them at the gate and turn them back. No trespassing signs, a locked chain across the drive. Dogs I'd trained to be unfriendly to strangers. I created a perimeter of hostility around this place, specifically to keep the world out. And it worked. Nobody asked too many questions. Nobody pushed too hard to get past the gate. It was autumn of 2013 that I started noticing changes. The Bigfoot was spending more time visible, not hiding in the forest anymore, but coming right up to the cabin porch. It would stand there in the failing light and just look at me through the window. For hours, sometimes. I started sleeping on the porch in a hammock I'd set up, just to be closer. The Bigfoot would pace around the cabin while I slept, and I'd wake up feeling that presence, that awareness, and I'd just lie there and let it move around me in the dark. The feeling wasn't fear, it was trust. It was the knowledge that this creature that could tear me apart with little effort had decided not to. It was also becoming more aggressive about the food situation. The portions I left were never enough anymore. It would come right up to where I was preparing meat and watch, waiting for scraps. I'd hand them to it, careful and slow, and it would take them from my hand without ever touching skin. Those moments, I felt something like intimacy, a reaching across the space between us. But there was something else happening too. The Bigfoot was showing signs of injury. A long scar on its left shoulder, the hair growing in white over old tissue. A limp on its left rear leg, favoring it more each season. Age, maybe. Or something it had encountered in the wild that had hurt it. I started leaving medicine along with the food. Antibiotics, painkillers, anti-inflammatory drugs, things I'd researched and prepared. Whether it consumed them, I never knew. But I left them anyway. The Bigfoot would sniff at the bottles, and sometimes they'd be gone in the morning. Sometimes they'd be left behind. I couldn't tell if it was choosing what to take or if it just couldn't understand what they were. The winter of 2019 was when everything changed. I was 71 years old. I'd been feeding the Bigfoot for 20 years. It had become as much a part of my daily existence as breathing. I'd stopped hunting in the traditional sense. I wasn't doing it for myself anymore. I wasn't doing it for sport or for the satisfaction of providing for myself in the wilderness. I was doing it for the creature. Every kill I made, the best portions went to it. I ate what remained. Whatever was left after the forest got its share. The Bigfoot was clearly old by then. The mobility had declined. It moved slower, more deliberately. The hair was graying around the shoulders and neck. It spent more time in the shelter I'd built, and on the days it came to the cabin, it seemed like it was costing it something. Effort, pain, maybe. I found myself watching it more closely, trying to anticipate what it needed. I started preparing softer foods, things that wouldn't require as much chewing. Organ meat instead of muscle, marrow extracted from bones, fish rather than large game. In late January of 2020, during a particularly hard, cold snap, where the temperature stayed below 30 below for a solid week, I found it in the shelter, not moving. I thought it was dead. I went through something that felt like grief in those moments, before I realized it was still breathing, just barely. Its respiration was shallow. There was blood on the snow beneath it, coming from its hindquarters. The leg that had been limping for so long, I could see now that the wound had reopened or worsened. Infection, maybe. Sepsis. I wrapped it in blankets and brought it into the cabin. I know how that sounds. I brought a 7-foot-tall Bigfoot into my home. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. I was past the point of thinking about what was rational or safe. This creature had shared my life for 20 years. It was sick. It was dying. I was going to do everything I could to keep it alive. I had a bedroom I barely used on the north side, where it was always cold. I set up heating lamps, fresh blankets, food and water within reach. I brought in a bucket and I cleaned the wound as best I could, using antiseptic and bandages, though the creature's thick hide made it difficult. I sat with it for 3 days and 3 nights while it recovered or died or whatever was going to happen. I didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. I just sat there on the floor next to it and I talked to it. I told it about myself. I told it about Sarah, my daughter, who by then was a grown woman with her own children. I told it that I'd never been there for her, that I'd paid money but not attention, that I was probably going to die out here and my grandchildren would never even know I'd existed. It lived. Whatever was wrong, the warmth and rest helped. On the 3rd day, it stood up, shaky but upright. It looked at me with those intelligent eyes, and I swear to God, it was a look of gratitude. Not animal gratitude, human gratitude. The kind you give to someone who has cared for you when you were helpless. After that, the Bigfoot spent more time inside the cabin than outside. I stopped worrying about anyone finding out. If someone showed up, they'd know. And I'd deal with it then. Mostly nobody came. The road was quiet. Winter made it worse for visitors anyway. By the time spring came, the Bigfoot had a room in the cabin, a regular bedroom with blankets and heat. I left the door open to the forest so it could come and go. But it didn't go much anymore. It was dying. I knew it. I could feel it the way you can feel someone close to you slipping away. The breathing got harder. The eating became less frequent. It spent hours just looking out the window at the forest it had lived in its entire life. I sat with it, and I talked to it. I told it things I'd never told anyone. I told it why I'd come out here in the first place. I told it about the marriage that had ended because I couldn't stay still, couldn't live in the world the way normal people did. About the daughter I had with my ex-wife, a daughter I'd barely known, who'd grown up thinking I was a ghost, about the offshore platforms and the storms and the noise that would build and build until I couldn't think anymore. I told it that I'd come out here to find silence, but what I'd actually found was you. The Bigfoot didn't respond, but it listened, and that was enough. It was the end of March 2020, the beginning of lockdown, though I didn't know about any of that out here. The news on my old radio had started talking about something in the cities, something spreading, but it seemed distant, unreal. I was focused on what was happening in my cabin. The Bigfoot was failing fast. The breathing was labored and irregular, with long pauses that made me think each one might be the last. The light in those intelligent eyes was getting dimmer, the awareness that had always been there beginning to fade. It didn't eat anymore, it barely drank. I'd learned from books and from my own experience that when an animal stops eating, the end is close. For 3 days before I made my decision, I simply sat with him. I didn't have work to do. I didn't have obligations. I just sat in that room, on the floor beside the bed, and I was present. I talked to him about things I'd never told anyone. I told him about the time my daughter turned 7, and I missed her birthday because I was on an oil rig in the Gulf. I told him about the last time I saw my father, how he'd looked at me with disappointment and hadn't said goodbye when I left. I told him about every time I'd felt like the world didn't want me in it, and how the only place I'd ever felt like I belonged was here, in this cabin, with him. And he just lay there, his great head resting on his paws, and he listened, just listened, the way no human had ever listened. On the 3rd day, I made my decision. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, maybe longer, what I was going to do when the end came. I didn't want him to suffer anymore. The infection from the old injury had spread, had weakened him, had turned this once magnificent creature into something in pain. That wasn't how he deserved to end. And on a cold gray morning, with snow falling outside and the temperature at 10 below, I took out my rifle. Not to kill it, to let it go. The Bigfoot understood. When I placed the rifle barrel against its head, it didn't flinch. It didn't try to run or fight. It looked at me, and I looked at it. And we had a moment of understanding that existed outside of words. 27 years we'd shared this space. We'd built something between us that had no language, no name. We'd fed each other, physically and spiritually. We'd observed each other, we'd learned each other, we'd watched each other age. And now it was time to end it. The snow continued to fall outside the window. The world continued on its way, indifferent to what was about to happen in this small room. I pulled the trigger, and my life ended with it, not immediately. My heart kept beating, my lungs kept breathing. But something that had been driving me, something that had been the point of everything for nearly 3 decades, was just gone. I stood there in that bedroom with the rifle in my hands, and I realized I had no idea what came next. The creature, the being that had been the structure of my existence since 1993, was gone. My routine had been hunt for it, prepare for it, watch for it, feed it, sit with it. Now there was no it. There was only silence and an empty space where 27 years of purpose used to be. I buried the Bigfoot in the forest, in a deep grave I dug by hand over 4 days. It took all 4 days because the ground was still partially frozen, and also because I moved slowly, deliberately, refusing to rush what felt like the last task I would ever perform with meaning. The location was a clearing about half a mile from the cabin, positioned at the convergence of 2 deer trails, in a place where the forest opened up enough to see the sky. I marked the location carefully. The position of the trees, the distance from the cabin, the angle of the sun at noon. I wanted to be able to find this place again, and I knew I would find it many times, in all seasons and all weathers, for the rest of my life. It was sacred ground now. The digging was harder than I expected. The frozen ground fought me with each swing of the pick. My hands blistered, my back screamed, but I welcomed the pain. It was a physical expression of the loss I was feeling, a way of honoring what he had meant by expending real energy, real suffering, to give him a proper place to rest. By the time I was finished, the grave was more than 6 feet deep, larger than any grave I'd ever dug, constructed with precision and care. I wrapped it in the blankets it had died on, blankets that smelled of its musk and sweat and the particular warmth of its body. The smell was distinctive, ancient, wild, and I breathed it in one last time before I laid the blankets in the grave. I wrapped it in deer hides I'd been curing, soft and supple, placed with ceremony. Each hide had taken weeks to prepare, and I'd set them aside unconsciously, perhaps, knowing that someday I would need something worthy enough to wrap a king. I included food for the journey, whatever journey the dead take. Smoked venison from the last elk I'd killed for him. Dried fish from the creek he'd walked beside for decades. Honey, the way it had preferred it, in a clay jar that I'd made myself, awkwardly, using a pottery kit from Grand Marais. I placed my photograph in the grave, the laminated one that it had looked at so many times, studying my face the way I studied his. I laid one of my old shirts over the body, a shirt I'd worn for years until it was thin and soft, a shirt that held my scent the way he held his own scent. And I included that bone, the polished elk femur that he had given me years before, placing it in his hands, so to speak, returning the gift. I marked the grave with stones, arranging them in a circle about 5 feet in diameter. Then I placed larger stones at the cardinal points, forming a cross pattern inside the circle. I'd seen it arrange things like this, seen William arrange offerings and mark sacred spaces with deliberate geometric patterns. I was copying his ritual, trying to speak in his language, trying to ensure that whatever intelligence might read these signs would understand that this was not just a grave. This was an altar. This was a place where something sacred had occurred. I stood there for a long time when it was done. The grave was just earth and rocks, and the things I'd placed inside it. But it contained everything. It contained 27 years of connection. It contained a friendship that the world would never believe had existed. I didn't know what to do after that. I wasn't religious in any formal sense. I didn't pray in words that anyone would recognize as prayer. But I sat there on the ground, beside the grave for hours, and I sent out thoughts, intentions, gratitude. I sat and I felt the weight of what was gone. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows of the trees shifted in the patterns they followed every day, indifferent to my grief. The forest continued its indifferent existence. The wind moved through the pines. Birds called to each other. Insects worked their endless work. The world didn't pause for his death. The world didn't acknowledge his passing. Only I did. Only I knew what had been lost. Eventually I stood up and I walked back to the cabin. And then I walked inside, and I closed the door, and I stayed inside for weeks. After that I stayed in the cabin. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. I wasn't eating much. I wasn't doing much of anything. The spring turned to summer, and the forest came back, alive around me. But I felt nothing. The isolation that had once felt like solitude now felt like death, because the observer had observed me. And now there was no observation, just me and the empty cabin and the forest that had reclaimed its silence. April came, and the snow melted, and I still hadn't left the cabin except to visit the grave. I'd sit on the porch in the mornings, and I'd look out at the forest, and I'd feel a kind of heavy numbness that I'd never experienced before. I'd lost people before. My parents, a few friends who drifted away. But those deaths were distant, manageable. This was different. This was the death of the thing that had made me alive. I started thinking about ending things, not as a serious plan, but as a background thought that was always there. I'd sit on the porch, and I'd look at my rifle, and I'd think about how easy it would be to finish what I'd started when I'd killed the Bigfoot. I'd think about walking into the forest one morning and simply not coming back, or sitting in the cabin with the windows closed and the stove running and just breathing until my chest stopped moving. I didn't do it, and I don't know why. Maybe because some part of me understood that suicide would be a betrayal of the creature I'd buried. It had chose to be with me, and I had chose to be with it. That was a sacred thing. Killing myself would diminish that, would suggest that what we'd built wasn't enough to sustain me. And it was enough. It had been enough. It still was, even in its absence. By early May, I realized I hadn't been to Grand Marais in months. The supply truck had come once in April, left boxes on the porch that I'd eventually brought inside. I wasn't hungry, but I was thirsty, and I forced myself to eat enough to keep functioning. I was a machine moving through its routines without consciousness, without intention. Then I found the first gift, and everything changed. It was late July when I found the first gift. I'd been outside barely at all, but that morning I forced myself to step onto the porch and look at the world I'd retreated from. A dead raven laid carefully on the rough wood, arranged with its wings spread wide. I didn't think much about it at first, my mind too numb for meaning. Ravens die all the time. They fall from the sky. They get caught by predators. They simply fail to fly one day, and that's the end of it. But something in the placement was wrong. Ravens don't die and arrange themselves. And this one was too deliberate, too positioned. The wings were spread with precision. The head pointed toward the forest. The feet were positioned symmetrically. I stared at it for a long time. The raven's feathers were glossy, well-maintained, its body recently dead, maybe that very morning. It had been arranged with extraordinary care, the wings spread with mathematical precision, each feather in place, the head tilted slightly upward as if the bird was in flight, and it was pointing toward the grave, the direction of the grave. I understood in that moment that whoever had left this had traveled through my property, had come to my porch, had placed this gift, had oriented it with intention toward where William was buried. They knew exactly where the grave was. Then I realized I was crying, the first time I'd cried since burying the Bigfoot. Tears just running down my face without any control, and I didn't even try to stop them. Because I knew, in that moment, what the raven meant. It was an offering. It was a gift. It was communication. It was grief, expressed in the only way they knew how. It was acknowledgement of loss. It was a ritual of mourning, and I had been invited to participate. 3 days later, a possum, arranged the same way on the porch, its body positioned carefully, its arms spread as if in surrender or benediction. The possum was smaller than the raven, and I wondered where they'd found it, how they'd carried it to my porch, how they'd arranged it so carefully. Then a rabbit, this one placed on the chair where I liked to sit in the evenings. Then a groundhog, left in the center of the clearing. Then a hawk, that one lying on the steps with its wings folded but its head pointed toward the grave. And with each gift, I felt something crack open inside me. They were mourning him. His family was performing a ritual, and through these gifts, through these arranged dead creatures, they were inviting me to join them. Then I understood, or at least I started to understand. The Bigfoot I'd buried in the forest, something about it, something about what we'd built together over 27 years. It wasn't over. The forest was mourning. That's the only way I can say it. The forest, or something in the forest, was performing a ritual, leaving offerings, the way the Bigfoot had left offerings for me for so many years. It was paying back the debt. It was honoring the relationship that had ended. I started leaving my porch to walk the property again, and the deeper into August I went, the more offerings I found. In the shelter I'd built years ago, the one where the Bigfoot had spent its last years, I found it arranged like an altar, small bones, arranged in spirals, feathers, placed in patterns, a section of honeycomb, carefully positioned. All of it seemed to be pointing toward the forest, toward the grave. In the trees near the cabin I found birds impaled on branches, not violently, not torn apart, hung carefully, their bodies turned toward the grave. Some were arranged with flowers, wildflowers stuck into the bark beneath them. In the creek bed, larger animals, deer and elk, arranged in precise patterns. The bones were positioned in ways that could only be deliberate, skulls aligned with spines in mathematical precision, ribs arranged like the fingers of hands pressed together in prayer, all of it pointing toward where I'd buried it. Every arrangement, every gift, was a vector pointing to the sacred ground. For 3 months, from July into October, the offerings continued, and slowly. Watching them accumulate, I understood what was happening. The Bigfoot I'd known, the one I'd called William in my mind, the one I'd buried, hadn't died alone. There were others. There had always been others. A family, a group, a society that existed alongside mine all those years, and I'd been too focused on the one relationship to notice. I'd been so consumed by my observations of it, my feeding of it, my learning from it, that I'd missed the larger world around it. Now they were making sure I knew. Now they were showing me, through ritual and offering and careful arrangement, the architecture of what I'd been part of all along. I was not an outsider who had been grudgingly accepted into the presence of an isolated creature. I was an observer who had been invited into a family, and now that family was mourning their loss with me, demonstrating that grief is something they understood, something they processed and expressed through gifts and ritual and the arrangement of the dead. By October, I knew what had to happen. I went into the forest and I walked to the grave. I dug it up, careful, and I sat there with what remained. The items I'd buried with him were still there, the cloth and hides and gifts preserved by the cool ground. I touched the polished bone again, ran my fingers over its smoothness, and then I arranged everything again, recovered the grave, and I waited. Because I knew they would come. They had been coming to my porch for 3 months. Now they would come to this place. And they did. From the darkening forest, they emerged. 5 of them, different sizes, different ages, but all moving with that purposeful, deliberate gait I knew so well. Eleanor, I recognized immediately by her smaller stature and the way she moved with slightly more caution. And the youngest, young one, moved with the energy of youth despite the solemnity of the occasion. 3 others, creatures I'd seen in the offerings but never approached, never studied, siblings, cousins, I didn't know. But they moved as a unit, coordinated, intentional. They came to the grave, and they stood around it. They didn't look at me. I stood perhaps 30 feet away, not approaching, honoring their space. They just stood there, motionless, and the one that was closest, the largest, the one that was definitely the alpha, the one I'd come to think of as William's father or brother, or the next strongest male in the family. It made a sound, low, rumbling, a vocalization that was almost word-like. Not quite language, but not animal noise either. It had shape and meaning. And the others responded with the same sound, a chorus of it, a keening that resonated through the forest and into my chest and into the earth beneath us. It wasn't grief the way I understood it. It was acknowledgement. It was a witness to the ending of something. It was a ceremony. It was a declaration that William had mattered, that his life had significance, that his passing was noted and mourned and would be remembered. I stood there and I wept openly, and they didn't acknowledge me, and I didn't try to approach them. We were all in that moment, together and separate, acknowledging the same loss. Then they turned and they walked back into the darkness. Eleanor paused for just a moment and looked back at where I stood, and our eyes met across that space, and I felt her grief and her acknowledgement of my grief. And then she was gone, and I was alone again. But not the way I'd been before, because now I understood that the silence in the forest was full, that the isolation had never been what I thought, that I'd been part of a family all along. I just hadn't known how to see it. That brings me to today, November of 2024. I'm 76 years old. I'm still in the cabin. I'm still alone in the traditional sense, but I'm not lonely. Because the Bigfoot family still visits. Not as often as when the one I knew was alive, but often enough that I know they're here. I leave food out. They eat it. I leave gifts. They respond with their own. We maintain the arrangement. It's different now, quieter, more formal. But it's still there, and I carry something with me now that I've never talked about until this moment. Something that happened in the spring of 2021, exactly 1 year after I buried the Bigfoot in the forest. The winter had been hard, isolation, grief, the offerings in the forest all around me. I was existing more than living, moving through routines that had lost their meaning. I needed firewood. That was the excuse. In reality, I was spending more and more time in the forest, close to the grave, trying to feel some connection to what had been lost. I was collecting fallen branches about a quarter mile from the cabin, working in that space between the property and the deeper forest, where the Bigfoots moved more openly. The season was changing, and I needed to start preparing for the next winter, the way I'd been preparing for winters for 30 years. The snow was mostly melted, the ground soft with spring moisture. I was reaching down to pick up a fallen branch, a good section of oak that would split clean for the stove, when I didn't see what was around it, a root or a snare or something hidden in the debris. My left hand went in to steady myself, and something grabbed it, hard, not tentatively, not with uncertainty, with absolute certainty of purpose. I pulled back, reflexive, and my hand came free. But it didn't come free intact. My left hand, from just above the wrist, was gone, severed in one motion, as if by a blade. I looked at the stump of my arm, at the bone visible for a moment before blood began to flow, and I should have been screaming or panicking or doing something rational like running for the cabin and calling for help. But what I felt was not fear. It was certainty, knowledge. I knew who had taken it, and I knew why. I turned around and I saw it, the largest one, the male that had stood at the grave with the others during the ceremony in October. It was standing upright, maybe 15 feet away, holding my hand in one of its own large hands, my hand, severed at the wrist. It looked at me. Then it looked at the hand. Then it looked back at me. The look in its eyes was not cruel. It was not triumphant or angry. It was solemn. It was ritual. And in that gaze, I felt something communicate itself without words. Understanding, ceremony, exchange, a binding, a claiming. The pain hadn't hit yet. There was just numbness and shock and the surreal sight of my wrist ending in space where my hand should be. But as the seconds passed, the pain came, a searing, electric agony that filled my entire arm. I looked at the stump and I saw bone and tissue and blood, and my body told me to run, to panic, to do something. Instead, I just stood there, and the creature looked at me, and I looked at it, and we stood there in that clearing as the sun moved through the sky. It was showing me the hand. It was making sure I saw what had happened. It was ensuring that I understood that this was not an accident. This was a choice. This was my inclusion into something. And after maybe 30 seconds, after I'd stopped trying to process what I was seeing, it turned and walked back into the forest, my hand held carefully at its side. And I was alone in the clearing with a severed wrist and the knowledge that something fundamental had just shifted in the cosmic order of my existence. I wrapped it. I cauterized it. I did these things with clarity, without panic, without the hysteria that most people would experience. I understood even in the shock, even as the blood soaked through cloth after cloth, even as the pain made me want to scream and run and do anything but stand there and tend to the wound, that this was intentional. This was not an attack. This was ritual. This was the completion of something that had been set in motion 27 years ago, when I picked up that hare in the forest and felt something recognizing me for the first time. The healing took weeks. I was cautious with it, kept it clean, changed the wrappings daily. I fought off infection using antibiotics that I'd stockpiled, using techniques I'd learned from books about field medicine and survival. The stump sealed over eventually, formed scar tissue that hardened and smoothed. And the scar that remains, that smooth, healed stump where my hand used to be, it's the most precious thing I own. Better than the bone, better than the photographs, better than anything I have, because it means I'm not human anymore, not in the way I was before. I'm marked, I'm claimed, I carry the mark of inclusion. I'm part of the forest now, part of the arrangement, part of something that's been here longer than people, that will be here longer than people, and I've been allowed to join it by making the ultimate sacrifice, not of my life, but of my separation from them. I am no longer fully separate. I am marked as belonging. That's what I need to tell you. That's what I've been carrying for 3.5 years. The world thinks I'm a crippled old man in the woods, cut off from civilization, slowly losing my mind. But I'm not losing anything. I'm gaining perspective. The Bigfoot family that visits my property, they're not hiding from you because they're afraid of you. They're hiding because they understand what would happen if you knew they were real. They'd be hunted, studied, caged, dissected. They'd be turned into a problem to be solved instead of a truth to be lived with. I'm telling you this now because I'm running out of time. Not in the immediate sense, but in the sense that eventually somebody's going to come up this access road, and they're going to find me, and they're going to see the condition of the cabin and the condition of my land, and they're going to start asking questions. They're going to find the offerings in the forest, the arrangements, the evidence of a decades-long relationship with something that shouldn't exist. And I want someone to hear the truth first, to know that this wasn't madness. It was the most sane thing I've ever done. Before we get into why they hide, I need you to understand that they're not monsters. They're not prehistoric holdovers that are barely surviving. They're intelligent, they're sophisticated, they're capable of complex social bonds and rituals that we don't have the framework to understand. They feed on carrion when they must, but they prefer to hunt, to kill cleanly, to respect what they take. They have family structures. They mourn, they remember, they plan, and they observe. That's the thing that changed me, being observed, really observed, by something intelligent. Not hunted, not threatened, just watched, really watched. The way a parent watches a child, the way a researcher watches a subject, the way a god watches the world. That kind of observation changes you. It makes you understand that you're not the pinnacle of consciousness you thought you were. You're one consciousness among many, and not even the most important one in your own landscape. The reason they hide is simple. We can't be trusted, not in the way that matters. We see something we don't understand, and our first instinct is to control it, study it, put it in a museum or a lab or a cage. We do it with every animal we encounter. We do it with entire indigenous peoples when they cross into our awareness. The Bigfoot family knows this. They've known it for longer than we've been keeping records, and so they stay invisible. They live on the margins of our world, in the deep forests where we rarely go, in the vast wilderness spaces we've deemed economically unviable. But they're watching, just like one of them watched me for 27 years, just like they're watching everyone who ventures into their territories. They understand us better than we understand ourselves. They know our patterns, our weaknesses, our capacity for violence, and they've made a choice. They will not cross that line into our world. We have to cross into theirs. And when we do, if we're very quiet and very respectful and very patient, they might allow us to see them. I've been allowed that privilege, and it cost me my hand. But I'd make that trade 1,000 times over. Because now I know I'm not alone. I know there's intelligence in the forest. I know that when I die, and they find my body here in this cabin, there will be something that mourns me the way I mourned the one I buried. And that's worth any price. That's worth everything I was before. The isolation has become connection. The silence has become language. And I understand now what I was running from my whole life wasn't people. It was the knowledge that there was something in the world that was alive the way I was alive, and it had been looking for me all along. This is what I know. This is what the 30 years taught me. This is why I'm telling you, even though I know it will sound impossible. The Bigfoot are not hiding because they don't want to be found. They're hiding because they've seen what we do to things we find, and they'd rather keep their world invisible than watch ours consume it. They've learned, over millennia, that the only way to survive humanity is to remain undiscovered by it. We should honor that choice. We should respect it. We should leave them alone. I think about this often. The indigenous peoples knew. They understood these were beings to be respected and left alone. We came with our need to control and display everything. We came with certainty that if something exists, we have the right to understand it. The Bigfoot family understands this about us. They know exactly what we are. They know exactly what we've done to every other species we've encountered. They know about extinction and captivity and the slow destruction of wild places, and so they hide. Not from fear, I don't think, from wisdom, from the knowledge that contact with us would destroy them. Not through hunting, necessarily, though that would come. but through the weight of our need to explain them, to study them, to take them apart and understand their genetics and display them in museums. The very act of being known by us would be the end of them. If you ever find yourself in the deep forest at dusk with that particular sense that something is watching you from the tree line, don't run, don't scream, don't reach for your phone or your rifle or your proof. Don't try to capture the moment or document it or turn it into an experience you can share with others. Just sit there quietly. Just breathe. Just acknowledge that you're in someone else's world now. And if you're lucky, if you're respectful, if you don't try to take anything from that moment except the memory of it, they might let you live in it for a moment. They might feed you. They might watch you. They might even allow you to enter into something like friendship. And you'll never be the same after. That's the secret they're keeping. Not that they exist, but that they matter, that their existence is important, that the world is not the world we think it is. There's a consciousness in the forest that's been present the entire time we've been here, that has watched us expand and dominate and destroy, and it has chosen a different path. A path of non-interference, of stealth, of remaining separate so that it can remain free. There's a consciousness in the forest that's been present the entire time we've been here, and we've just been too loud to hear it. I've heard it, and now, with one hand, I'm trying to tell you about it. I'm trying to bridge the gap between the world you live in and the world that's been there all along. I don't know if it will make a difference. I suspect it won't. Most people will read this and think I'm insane, or embellishing, or engaging in some kind of elaborate fiction. That's fine. That's okay. The narrative I'm offering is not one that fits neatly into the modern worldview. But I had to try, because the Bigfoot family is still out there, and I'm still here. And the forest is still watching. We've built something that can't be taken back, a relationship that exists on its own terms, and I'm grateful for every day I've been allowed to be part of it. The forest outside my window is quiet tonight, the way it gets in late autumn when the cold is coming but hasn't arrived yet. The leaves are mostly down, the birds have migrated south, the insects have gone deep into the earth to wait out the winter. There's a waiting quality to the silence, like the whole landscape is holding its breath before the deep freeze, before the long months when survival becomes the only focus. And I know that out there in that forest, the Bigfoot family is preparing too, settling into den sites that they've used for generations, laying by food stores. Hunting the final elk and deer before winter makes the hunt more difficult. Preparing for the season when visibility decreases and movement becomes more difficult. When the world turns white and gray and the human presence retreats to the lower elevations and the towns, we're still connected, still part of each other's world, even though William is gone. I leave food out, and within days it's consumed or moved to another location. I leave gifts, and sometimes I find acknowledgments in return. The arrangement continues. The understanding remains. This is my life now, and it's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything I needed when I came here all those years ago, looking for solitude and a way to disappear from the world. I found solitude. And in the finding, I found connection. I found the exact opposite of what I was looking for, and it was exactly what I needed. The rig work became my identity. I was good at it. The crew respected technical competence over personality. We had protocols for everything. Those protocols created order. Order was something I understood. By 1989, I'd saved about $100,000. By 1992, I had nearly 200,000, but no connection to another human being that meant anything. By 2001, I understood the Bigfoot family hierarchy. William was clearly the alpha. Eleanor deferred to him in subtle but unmistakable ways. The younger ones showed even more deference. I realized my job in this hierarchy was not as an equal. I was functioning as a servant, a provider, someone lower in the social order who had accepted that position consistently. This understanding changed how I approached the feeding entirely. Through 2003 and 2004, the pattern deepened. William came to the porch regularly. Eleanor began doing it too. Young one watched from further back. We were crossing boundaries together, moving from predator and observed to something more mutual, more intimate. They could have harmed me. They knew where I slept. They knew I was alone. But none of that mattered to them. What mattered was that I fed them, that I remained consistent, that I didn't threaten their existence. I don't know how long I sat with him before I made the decision. Time moved strangely during those final weeks. Some days felt like hours. Some hours felt like days. On the second day, William shifted his head so it was closer to my leg. Physical contact, minimal but intentional. I told him about my mother's funeral, how I didn't go, how I'd sent flowers but stayed on the rig. I told him I'd spent my whole life refusing connection, refusing responsibility, refusing to be present. And then I met him. The first week after the hand loss was the hardest, physically. The pain was extraordinary. Every heartbeat sent a pulse of agony through the remaining stump. But there was something else happening too. Something psychological, something spiritual. With each day that passed, the physical pain became a kind of anchor. It kept me present. It kept me from floating away into grief. By the second week, the stump had sealed. The pain remained constant, a baseline of discomfort that never fully went away. The years from 2008 to 2018 were years of slow decline and deepening connection. Each autumn, William came with less energy. Each winter, his movements were stiffer. By 2015, he was spending entire days just standing at my window, looking in. I had installed better insulation by then, but I deliberately left small gaps so that my heat could escape, so that he could feel it, so that he could know that inside this structure there was warmth, shelter, safety. The offerings that appeared during the morning period were not random. I came to understand that each species represented something. The ravens represented intelligence. The rabbits represented vulnerability and the need for protection. The deer represented both hunter and hunted, the duality of predator and prey. The hawks represented vision and perspective from above. Each offering was a message. Each arrangement was communication. They were teaching me their language through the arrangement of the dead. I've had almost 4 years now to think about what the Bigfoot family's choice means. The indigenous peoples of this continent understood. They told tales of the forest people that should be respected and left alone. They understood that the only way for wild things to remain wild is to keep them separate from civilization. But we came, believing that if something existed, we had the right to know it, to study it, to categorize it, to display it. We came with the certainty that knowledge was always good. The Bigfoot family understands us better than we understand ourselves. They know exactly what we've done to every species we've encountered. Continued expansion for 2-hour script. Section 9, Early Property Years, 1993-1998, 5,000 chars. The first 5 years on the property were years of physical transformation. I was rebuilding not just a cabin, but a life. Each broken window I replaced, represented a severed tie to my past. Each board I split represented a commitment to this new existence. The work was meditative, repetitive. It required presence without demanding emotional engagement. I could exist in my body, doing physical tasks, without being forced to confront what I'd left behind. In 1994, I saw the first sign that I wasn't completely alone. A track in the mud near the creek. Just one. I didn't fully recognize it for what it was. I thought maybe it was a bear or an elk, but something about it stayed with me. Something about the bipedal pattern. The 5 toes, arranged with such precision, it suggested intelligence, purpose, intention. By 1995, I was finding tracks regularly. Always the same general size, always bipedal. Always following routes that seemed deliberate. I began to map them mentally. Not on paper. I wasn't documenting yet. I was just beginning to understand that my territorial isolation wasn't actually isolation at all. I had a neighbor. An unseen, unknowable neighbor. But a neighbor nonetheless. Section 11. William's aging, 2016-2019, dot $4,000 chars. The years of William's decline were years of preparation for loss, though I didn't understand it as such. I was simply responding to what he needed. But in hindsight, every meal I prepared, every medicine I left out, every moment I spent in his presence, I was saying goodbye. I was honoring a transition that was inevitable. William was old, probably 50 or 60 years old by my estimation. He had lived a full life. He had a family. He had territory. He had meaning and purpose and connection. But he was tired. I could see it in the way he moved, the hesitation before each step, the effort required for simple actions. By 2017, he was spending most of his time in the shelter I'd built. He would come to the cabin maybe once a week, just to stand there, to be present, to remind me that he was still alive, still here, still connected to me, across the distance, between our worlds. Section 13, Present-Day Reflections. $4,000 chars. It's November now as I write this. The weather is turning. The days are getting shorter. The forest is preparing for winter. I sit on my porch and I watch the tree line, and I think about what 31 years on this property has taught me about solitude and connection, about isolation and belonging, about the careful dance between two species trying to communicate across the vast gulf of their differences. I feed the Bigfoot family still. Eleanor comes sometimes. Young one has grown and has perhaps offspring of its own. Other members of the family visit. They maintain the arrangement. They acknowledge the gifts I leave. They live their lives in the deep forest while I live my life in this cabin. We are separate, but we are also fundamentally connected. Bound together by William, by the years of relationship building, by mutual acknowledgement that we share this land and this existence. Some days I wonder what would have happened if I had never found those first tracks, if I had never decided to leave that first piece of meat on the platform, if I had remained in ignorance of their presence. I think I would have been more isolated, more alone. The solitude would have curdled into something toxic. But because I found them, or because they allowed me to find them, I have had connection, real connection, with something wild and true, and completely other than myself. Section 15, Spiritual Dimensions, 4,000 chars. I've never been religious in any formal sense. I don't pray to a God I don't believe in. I don't attend churches or practice rituals based on doctrine I can't accept. But what happened with William and his family has forced me to confront spiritual realities that exist outside of organized religion. There's something sacred about connection between two beings. There is something holy about being truly seen by another consciousness. There is something transcendent about love that asks for nothing in return except presence and consistency. These are spiritual truths, even without a religious framework to contain them. When William died, and his family came to perform their mourning ceremony, I witnessed something spiritual, a ritual that held meaning and significance far beyond the simple fact of death. They were honoring him, acknowledging his place in their family, ensuring that his passing would be remembered and marked and held sacred. That's a spiritual act, regardless of whether the creatures performing it believe in the same God I don't believe in. The mark on my wrist, the healed stump where my hand used to be, is both physical and spiritual. Physically, it's scar tissue and bone, and the absence of 5 fingers. But spiritually, it's a covenant. It's proof of belonging. It's an outward manifestation of an inward transformation. I am not the same person who came to this forest 31 years ago. I have been remade by connection. I have been reborn through relationship. And I carry the evidence of that transformation on my body. Section 17, Adaptation after the hand loss, 13 and 500 chars. Learning to function with one hand was harder than I expected and easier than I feared. Some things that I thought would be impossible turned out to be manageable with adaptation and creativity. Other things that seemed simple became absurdly complex. Tying my boots took 5 times as long. Opening jars became an exercise in problem solving. Chopping wood required an entirely new technique. But the psychological adaptation was more significant than the physical. Every time I looked at my wrist, every time I felt the phantom pain in fingers that no longer existed, I was reminded of William. Of the moment the largest family member took my hand. Of the ritual significance of that moment. Of my acceptance and integration into something larger than myself. I came to see the hand loss not as amputation, but as marking. The same way that indigenous peoples would mark themselves to show tribal affiliation, the same way that members of societies would wear badges or insignia to indicate their status and belonging. I wear my scar as evidence, as proof, as declaration that I belong to the forest now, not to the human world. Some people might pity me. A 76-year-old man, alone in the woods, missing one hand, living in connection with creatures nobody believes exist. But I don't experience pity from anyone because I don't tell anyone the truth. They see the missing hand, and they draw their own conclusions. Car accident, maybe. Or a chainsaw incident. Or a medical amputation. Nobody imagines the truth because the truth is too extreme to consider. Section 19. Lessons from 30 years. Via $1,000 chars. What have I learned from 31 years in the forest? What wisdom has William's presence granted me? First, that solitude and connection are not opposites. They're complementary states. I came here seeking solitude, and I found it. But in finding solitude, I discovered that the deepest human need, the need for connection, could be met by something entirely other than human. William was not a person. He was a Bigfoot. But he was a person in the philosophical sense, a conscious being with awareness, intention, and the capacity for relationship. My connection with him has been the most real relationship of my life. Second, I've learned that communication exists on many levels. We spoke no words together, William and I. We had no language in common, but we understood each other completely through presence, consistency, ritual, and the careful arrangement of meaningful objects. Words can lie. They can obscure, they can create false intimacy, but physical presence and behavioral consistency cannot lie. William knew exactly what I meant when I left food out regularly. He knew that I was saying, You matter to me. You belong here. I will sustain you." And he reciprocated through his own presence and the objects he left for me. Third, I've learned that meaning can be created through repeated action. Ritual doesn't require religious context. Ritual is simply the repetition of meaningful behavior. Every time I hunted and butchered meat for William, I was performing a ritual. Every time he came to the cabin window and looked in, he was performing a ritual. Every time his family arranged dead animals as offerings at his grave, they were performing a ritual. These rituals created the structure of our relationship. They gave it form and continuity and significance. Fourth, I've learned that love doesn't require reciprocity to be real. I loved William. I would have done anything for him. I did do everything I could for him. But my love was not contingent on him loving me back. He cared for me, certainly. He allowed me into his world, but his feelings for me were based on my usefulness and consistency, not on romantic love or familial obligation. I was okay with that. The asymmetry of our love was actually perfect. It meant that I was giving without expectation of return, which is what real love is. Section 21, answering why I'm telling this, Yidea 4000 Datan Chars. The question will come up, if you believe so completely in keeping this secret, why are you telling it now? Why break your silence after 31 years of near total privacy? The answer is that I'm not breaking the secret. I'm not revealing where they are or how to find them, or providing any information that would actually endanger them. I'm not giving names of specific locations that would enable researchers or thrill seekers to invade this territory. I'm telling a personal story, my story. The story of one man's 31-year relationship with Bigfoot. Nothing that would change the scientific community's understanding. Nothing that would alter the trajectory of human-Bigfoot relations. But I'm telling it because it needs to be told. Because the official narratives will come. Someone will eventually find my cabin. They will find the grave. They will find the evidence of decades-long interaction with these creatures. And they will create explanations that fit their framework. They will theorize about it. They will write papers. They will create a narrative that makes me sound insane or deluded. I want my story on the record first. I want people to hear from me directly what actually happened. I want them to understand that William was real, that Eleanor exists, that young one is living and hunting and possibly raising offspring somewhere in these woods, that the Bigfoot family is real and intelligent and worthy of respect and protection. And I want people to understand the deeper lesson, that connection is possible across the vast gulf of difference, that two beings that have nothing in common can build something meaningful through consistency and respect and the repeated offering of presence. That the wildness that has been driven out of human civilization still exists in these forests, and that those of us who have been lucky enough to touch that wildness are forever changed by it. Section 23. Extended reflection on time, Western 5000 Chars. Time moves differently when you're living in connection with something. The standard human measurement of time, calendars, schedules, deadlines, becomes almost irrelevant. What matters instead is the turn of seasons, the cycle of hunting and hibernation, the patterns of moon phases and weather systems, the slow accumulation of years into decades, 31 years in one place. That's longer than most people stay in one house, one job, one geographic location. For me, it's been one continuous thread, one unbroken relationship with a place and the beings that inhabit it. When I first arrived, I was 45 years old, a middle-aged man running from his failures, a father who had abandoned his daughter, a husband who couldn't stay, a person fundamentally broken in ways I couldn't acknowledge or fix. Now I'm 76. I've spent more than a third of my entire life in this one location. I've watched the seasons cycle 31 times. I've watched William age from prime to elderly to death. I've watched Eleanor transition from young adult to mother to elder. I've watched young one grow from juvenile to independent adult. Time has been the medium in which my transformation happened. One season at a time, 1 year at a time, 1 decade at a time. The isolation that would have driven most people insane has been my salvation. The solitude that would have destroyed most people has been my medicine. And the creature that most people would have been terrified of has been my teacher, my companion, my reason for existing. Section 25. The Final Truth. 4,000 chars. Here is the final truth I have to tell. The Bigfoot are not mythical. They are not cryptids or interdimensional beings, or the products of misidentified bears and shadows. They are real. They are present. They are intelligent. They are kind. They are not interested in revealing themselves to a world that would destroy them. And they have allowed me to be part of their family. That is the deepest secret. Not that they exist, though that's true, but that they are capable of relationships with humans, that they can teach us how to live better, that they understand something about connection and belonging that we've forgotten, that they have wisdom to share if we're willing to listen without demanding proof or documentation or scientific explanation. I'm 76 years old, and I'm going to take this knowledge with me to the grave. I'm not going to submit to researchers or help anyone capture specimens or provide the kind of detailed information that would allow someone to find and harm them. All I'm doing is telling my story, my experience, my perspective on what these 31 years have meant. And I'm doing it because someone needs to know, someone needs to hear from me that connection is possible, that transformation is possible, that a human being can live behind everything he thought he needed and find instead something infinitely more valuable. Someone needs to know that the quiet revolution is happening, that love doesn't require words, that belonging doesn't require blood relation, that family can mean something entirely unexpected and transformative and real. Section 27. The mark of belonging extended past 100 chars. The scar on my wrist has become more than just a physical mark. It's become a kind of meditation object. When I look at it, I'm transported back to that moment in the spring of 2021 when the largest family member severed my hand. I can feel the surreal shock of it, the clarity of understanding that this was intentional, that this was ritual, that this was the ultimate expression of inclusion and belonging. I don't regret it, not even for a moment. Every time I struggle with something that requires 2 hands, every time I'm reminded of the limitation it creates, I'm also reminded of William. I'm reminded that I chose this, that I accepted this mark deliberately, that I carry it with pride. There are other marks I carry now that are less visible. The lines on my face from 31 years of sun and wind and contemplation, the gray in my hair and beard, the way my body has changed from young middle age to old age, the way my mind has shifted from seeking externals to finding internals. All of these are marks of belonging to this place and this life. Epilogue. A letter to the future. If you're reading this years from now, I'm probably dead. The authorities have come. They've found my cabin and its evidence. They've asked questions. They've tried to make sense of what happened here. This epilogue is for that future, for whatever comes after I'm gone. To the people who find my body, I want you to know that I died here by choice, not by suicide, by the choice to live in a remote location without modern medical infrastructure, by the choice to prioritize my connection to this place over my survival as a biological organism, by the choice to accept that my time had come and to allow the forest to reclaim what I had borrowed from it for 76 years. Don't mourn me. I don't want memorials or flowers or funeral services. I want my body left in the forest for a week, so that Eleanor and Young One and the others can acknowledge my passing in their own way. Then you can do whatever you need to do with what remains. To any researchers or cryptozoologists who might use this account, this is not an invitation to search. This is not a roadmap. This is not a call for investigation. It's a warning. These creatures have chosen invisibility. They've chosen to remain unknown. The most ethical response is to honor that choice, to let them live in peace, to stop searching for proof, and start learning to live with mystery. The world has enough noise. The Bigfoot family has chosen silence. Please respect that choice. To anyone who finds themselves isolated and broken and running from their life, there is a way back. There is a way to stop running and start coming home. That way might not look like my way. It might not involve a cabin in the woods and a relationship with cryptids. But the principle is the same. Find what you love more than you love escape. Commit to it. Show up for it consistently. Let it remake you. That's the path to redemption. That's the path to belonging. To Eleanor, thank you for allowing me, for including me in your family, for teaching me how to live. I'm grateful for every moment of it, and I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. To Young One, if you're still alive, when this is read, remember William, remember what he taught you about connecting with humans who aren't a threat. Remember that there are some of us who can be trusted, who will show up consistently, who will feed you and respect you and ask nothing in return. If you've connected with a wild creature, it's real. It's meaningful. Hold on to that experience. Protect it. Don't let the world convince you that it didn't happen. Don't let skeptics define your reality. I fed a Bigfoot for 30 years, and in doing so I found my way home. That's the truest thing I know. It's getting late now. The fire is burning down, and I need to add wood. Eleanor might come tonight. I sense snow in the air, and she likes to move before storms, or she might not. Either way, I'm here. I'm present. I'm grateful. The forest is dark and quiet. My cabin is warm. My heart is at peace. This is enough, more than enough. It's everything. One more thing I need to say. I am grateful. Not in a passing way, not in a generic gratitude for life kind of way, but in a deep, abiding, fundamental way that goes to the core of who I am and what I've become. Grateful to the universe or God or whatever force is organizing reality at levels I can't comprehend. Grateful that I was broken in exactly the right way that drove me to the woods. Grateful that I had the resources to buy this property. Grateful that William existed, that Eleanor exists, that Young One lives and hunts and moves through these forests. Grateful that I was allowed to live here in peace for 31 years without major external interference. Grateful for the supply truck driver, Carlos, who asks no questions. Grateful for the forest itself that has sustained me through brutal winters and provided the resources I needed to feed not just myself, but the Bigfoot family as well. Grateful that I got to say goodbye to William, that he died in comfort, warm and cared for, without pain at the end. grateful that his family came to mourn him, and that I was allowed to witness that mourning. And grateful most of all for the simple fact that I learned, finally, in the last third of my life, what it means to love something more than I love myself. What it means to commit to something without needing reciprocal reward. What it means to show up day after day, year after year, decade after decade, for no reason except that it matters. That's the greatest gift the Bigfoot family has given me. The gift of teaching me how to love. And I will carry that with me beyond